helping put these together. My name's Lauren Imes. I am with Washington State University Extension. I'm a program coordinator there, and very happy to be partnering with Snow Isle Libraries and the Friends of Hoopa Library to put on this presentation tonight. This is the second in our environmental series in an effort to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities we have to make a positive impact on our environment. Tonight's discussion is on the marine nearshore environment, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Linda Rhodes. She is a research microbiologist at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. She's conducted research in salmon infectious disease and immunology from aquatic toxicology around Puget Sound since the mid-1970s. She received a doctorate degree in molecular and cellular biology from the University of Washington. And Linda is also a member of the Island County Marine Resources Committee, which is an advisory body to the Island County with the goal to protect and restore marine resources in the Puget Sound through scientific monitoring, restoration projects, and community education. Some of you may know Anna Toledo is the MRC coordinator with the county there. So with that, I will thank you, Linda, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, great. So thank you very much for coming out tonight to listen to me talk about the nearshore. And you're probably thinking, you know, what does a microbiologist know about anything bigger than something you can see under the microscope? But you'll find in the talk that there are a lot of places that microbes, particularly bacteria, do have a very important role in sustaining that nearshore habitat. But also, because I work at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, I do have to interface with ecologists on a regular basis, because really what fisheries cares about are fish, not bacteria. So we are required to be integrative in many respects. And of course, my time with the MRC has really given me a wonderful opportunity to learn much more about the place where I live. I've been living for the last 30 years. So it's a great chance for me to put things together and to share this with you. Now, I'm not a marine ecologist. If you're a professional marine ecologist, you will probably be able to answer some questions better than me. And I also encourage you, if you do have a question, you can stop me at any point. That's fine with me, asking questions while we're going on. A little bit of definition on what I'm going to be talking about. This is basically the lay of the land. So if you think about the near shore, there's the upland area, which is really above this, what's called a supertidal area. So supertidal is above that mean high water line. And then there's kind of a log line, and above that is the upland. And it doesn't necessarily have to be forested. It could be a swamp, say, behind there. Between the mean high and the mean low, you've got the intertidal area where water goes in and out, and then the subtidal region. And along here are some other terms you might occasionally see: backshore, sublittoral, midlittoral. And then you'll also sometimes see the term neritic, which actually applies to a water depth where sunlight can actually make it to the bottom. Well, that's about 600 feet or 200 meters. So that's really most of Puget Sound. So technically, most of Puget Sound can be considered near shore, but I'm not going to get into the really deep areas today. And so talk about the geology. Let's just talk about the substrates. Where does that nearshore material come from? Well, it's rock, big rock, little rock, sometimes really, really little rock. And particularly in Island County, feeder bluffs are a major source of that rock. And here's Double Bluff doing its job. Sometimes it happens really quickly, like Ledgewood Beach, which slumped very quickly into Puget Sound. But most of the time, it's just coming down in dribs and drabs. Some of that material also comes from that upshore area, just through erosion, through, say, high tides coming in, waves crashing in, pulling sediment back out. And then particularly on the east side of Whidbey and the west side of Camano, and also the east side of Camano, rivers, we have a lot of river sediment that's coming in on Saratoga Pass from the Snohomish, the Stille, and the Skagit rivers. So the rock is coming from land, basically. The earth is constantly eroding away and uplifting things. So that's where a lot of that nearshore substrate comes from. You may have heard the term drift cells. So for geomorphologists, they like to think about how the sediment moves around, and what Washington Department of Ecology has done, and then this is a map that the county has taken advantage of, plotting it out. They figured out where the net movement of shoreline sediment is going. So that's what a drift cell is. So for example here, up near Hoypus Point, this yellow area on the map is a diverging drift cell. So that means the sediment is moving away. It could be going this way, it could be going that way, but it's moving away. If the green area here says that it's moving left to right. So on a drift cell, when they're talking about drift cells, it's as you would face the shore if it's moving from left to right. And so you can kind of see here is an aerial that this is the diverging cell area, and this is the left to right shore movement. And you can see a little bit of the sediment spewing out here. On the other hand, if you take a look at this point, you've got a left to right movement here, a right to left movement there, and that's what sustains this point of land. So these formations that you can see around the island, around the shoreline, that's because sediment is always on the move, and it's being moved by water, but wind is really the big driver for a lot of this. So you'll notice that a lot of these drift cells make sense to you when you realize that the predominant wind direction and strong wave movement is coming from the south. So sediment's always on the move, and that tends to sort stuff out. Smaller sediments will travel farther with lower velocity, and larger sediments will drop out at that same velocity. So there's a certain amount of sorting that's going on at the same time. Food web. So there's the sediment. Now we talk about biology. And so this is like a typical food web that you're going to get. This is one that was done for Central Puget Sound. And you can see that things are pretty complex, especially if you're trying to show everything in 2 dimensions. But I will show you, this is typically what you get to see for a food web. It's often shown as a very linear kind of process where you've got the primary producers down here, the guys that can do things with photosynthesis, they get eaten by somebody else. Carnivores are eating them, and then you go on and on to your top level carnivores. So this is kind of what you could call like a primary, well, not a primary, almost a photosynthetic food web. But you see this part over here, and this always gets kind of minimized when people talk about food webs. It's that decomposition, it's the detritus web, and really the detritus pathway in food webs often has a lot more energy flow in it than the primary, than the photosynthetic driver. And so here I'll show you kind of a simple, relatively simple. So this just means that the inputs are coming from outside of the system if you draw a box around the system. So this could be nutrients coming from a river system or stuff coming down off of the shore. And plants will take up these nutrients and they get eaten by herbivores. Herbivores get eaten by carnivores. So there's your nice linear system. But there's also this detritus, which actually everything that was ever alive is going to die, and it's going to turn into molecules or small stuff. And that's where the bacteria come in. Bacteria are responsible for degrading it back down into soluble nutrients or smaller pieces that can actually be consumed by other animals that maybe are filter feeders or just go through and sort out things from, say, water or from sediment. So in that case, this detritus-driven portion of the food web really has a lot more energy flow through it. Real simple graph. Here's a tropical rainforest. Very high amount of primary productivity. A lot of carbon per square meter per year being made. In our kind of a temperate water system, the phytoplankton-based part of the food web, which is that simple linear system, is relatively low compared to the detritus. And one reason is because you only get so much sunlight. Phytoplankton are only around for a certain time of the year, and then they're gone. They die, they sink, they get eaten by somebody else, but they're not out there doing their thing year-round. Whereas in the detritus-based system, there's a little bit of temperature sensitivity to that. Bacteria don't work so well at cooler temperatures, but basically they're working year-round. They're staying busy year-round. Just kind of a simple example to show you the relationship between the biological part and, say, the dissolved nutrients. So this,
Excuse me.
yes,
On the previous slide, where would a coral reef fit in there?
coral reef would be pretty far up here. There's a lot of productivity there, yeah. So on the left-hand side is a plot across months for dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is really a soluble nutrient that's being used by a lot of microbes and a lot of plants as well, and phosphate. So these are two kind of basic components that are needed by plants and microbes. On the other side, here's chlorophyll A, that's the green, and then this is microbial heterotrophic production, so that's part of that detritus-driven food web, again, across time. And what you see is kind of an inverse relationship, that these dissolved nutrients are higher in April, they drop down low in the summertime, and then they come back up again in October. On the other hand, you look at the chlorophyll A, which is a proxy for phytoplankton activity, and then bacterial activity. It's not too bad here. April is often when we have a diatom bloom, our first diatom bloom in Puget Sound. But then it starts to drop off because of sunlight dropping off. And then the microbial activity kind of goes down as well because the temperatures are also starting to drop. And then, so basically these guys are responsible for managing this. That's what you're seeing here is the microbial part of the system is controlling the nutrients. And these are just the six of the major subbasins in Puget Sound, just showing differences in pattern. So here's the Whidbey Basin. We have a very nice U-shaped nutrient curve, and not a very dramatic, but still a distinct kind of inverse U-shape for chlorophyll and heterotrophic production. I mean, look at Central Sound. Wow, that's where Seattle and Tacoma are. It's very big fluxes. So I'm going to kind of go through important organisms and aspects, starting with the uplands and kind of moving our way down into the subtidal area. So in the upland or the backshore, often that's going to be a bluff, a dune, a salt marsh. A lot of times if it's got a salt marsh, it drains really quickly and dries out, so it gets a little bit saltier. And there's wood or logs deposition at that seaward edge to it. It has both the photosynthetic and detritus-based food pathways represented there because it has a lot of terrestrial plants. A big part of what's driving the detritus-based food web are the vegetation that's being decomposed by fungi. Fungi play a huge role in breaking down detritus, terrestrial-derived detritus, and making that available to that nearshore area. And then the animals that you see there are going to be invertebrates, and you'll see how important invertebrates are to marine fish in a second. So there are insects as well as amphipods and isopods, the little pill bugs that you see. There are mammals that hang around in that area, and river otter certainly come out and feed in the nearshore area. And then birds, and we've all seen the big raptors, the fish-eating birds, and here's a heron fishing off of bull kelp. And if you're interested, there's a really nice master's thesis that was published in 2009, where the description of the vegetation in the backshore was done fairly clearly. And I think this person actually works for WSU in Thurston County now, so she's taken that interest on into her job. So talking about the backshore, we do here on Whidbey have a bird that uses that backshore area, needs that backshore area for reproduction. That's the Pigeon Guillemette. It has a distribution throughout the North Pacific, but it comes to certain areas to breed, and they excavate, or they have these holes in the feeder bluffs that they use as nests, We're really fortunate here to have the Guillemette Research Group have been studying Pigeon Guillemette now for almost a dozen years. And what they do is they look at they have people deployed at all of these sites to count the adult birds who could be breeding. And they also have specific spotters who watch nests to look for whether the nests are being used and whether or not there's food being brought back to the nest, which indicates that there are chicks in that nest. And this is a plot showing that over the last 11 years, and they have a 2019 data point as well, but they have basically seen somewhere between 900 and 1,000 adult birds around the island. We have steady numbers, and I don't know what the red is there. That's occupied burrows, and then the green is the burrows with chicks, but those numbers have stayed relatively stable. And what's been pretty neat about this is that because of their research, the Puget Sound Partnership is now adopting the Pigeon Guillemette as one of their indicator species as one of their vital signs. So I think the work that's being done here, they're taking that protocol to other parts of Puget Sound and applying it, because there are Pigeon Guillemette elsewhere in Puget Sound. So here's a bird that really needs that back shore. It's not really necessarily using the terrestrial component to it, but it needs that physical habitat. And so again, not disturbing that particular kind of backshore area is important. So going on to the supratidal zone, so that's just above that mean high water area. So that would be this area in here, okay, below this log area. So that has vegetation often is available or present along with the logs, and that can provide shade, which will modulate temperature in that area, and also some energy absorption. There's a lot of, when waves crash in there, it can take a lot of that energy and prevent it from, say, eroding certain areas upshore from that. There's a lot of organic matter that comes into that supratidal area, like leaf litter, wood, algae. You can kind of see there's a pile of algae or seaweed there that's called rack that gets thrown up on the beach and stays on the beach. So that's a food source as well for all of these little beach hoppers and amphipods. And also there's a lot of insects that are generated from this area. And here's a study that was done reported back in 2010. So these are juvenile Chinook salmon diets. So these are fish that are out of the river. This is not river data. They're out of the river, they're in the marine system, they're in the nearshore area, and their stomach contents were examined, and see all of these crosshatched areas are insects. This is how important insects are to the diet of these Chinook salmon who have come out of the river and the estuaries, and now they're in that nearshore area looking for food, and they're picking up a lot of these insects. Some of them get blown out onto the water. If there's any overhanging vegetation, they can get dropped into the water. But you see, it's really important all the way through September. In 2002, in fact, it looked like a lot of them were feeding on insects late in September. So these are the smaller fish that haven't quite switched over to eating other fish. That's what the dark black bars are, because they haven't gotten big enough. So insects are really important, and again, that's where that backshore and that supratidal area is really important for generating that kind of food for Chinook salmon. So now we move to the intertidal area, and this is probably where everybody is familiar with, because when you go to the beach, that's what you're walking on, is the intertidal area typically. And in fact, this is not Puget Sound, this is out on the coast, this is a razor clamming event, but you can see there are a lot of people out there digging clams, razor clams. And so people go out there to just enjoy what's there or to dig for food. Some people, certainly the tribes, this is part of their rights that they have for fishing, is the right to harvest shellfish in their normal and traditional areas. This is just kind of a cross section, and this is to show you that we have a lot of different kinds of animals in these muddy, sandy areas. This particular diagram had eelgrass, muddy sandy areas are okay for eelgrass, but eelgrass doesn't necessarily, that's not the optimal. Probably a lot of what you get in these muddy sandy areas are phytoplankton that fall out, that are either trapped in there or drop out. So your primary production in these areas is really coming from these guys, whereas the detritus-based part of the food web, that's really what's happening in these muddy sandy areas. So you've got the guys that are eating, that say grazing on anything that's been deposited, either material that either the eelgrass or the phytoplankton that are there. A lot of them, though, are going to be the filter feeders like crabs and clams, and these guys are sitting down in burrows, basically bringing water through and having it stick to some part of their gills to transport to their stomachs. Or you have detritus feeders like crab, and they're basically sifting through water and picking out little particulates and then ingesting that. So it's really a filtering system. And then the larger animals like fish and even plover and even sea slugs, they're predatory. They're eating these other organisms that are either detritus or filter feeders. And in some parts of the country, I think not so much here, some parts of the country, this intertidal zone is absolutely crucial for migratory birds who are moving, say, from the Arctic to, say, the Caribbean or to Central America, because they're counting on eruptions of certain kinds of amphipods to be there so they can stop, fatten up on that, and then go on the rest of their trip. Not so much around here. We tend to have sort of a continuous production of these kinds of sources of food for birds. And then if we move on to the sandy and gravelly intertidal zones, that really is a place that eelgrass likes to be. And here's a diagram that shows from Dan Pentilla that shows kind of the distribution of where the eelgrass might be in these lower intertidal regions, and not so much in the upper intertidal regions. But what's going on in these upper intertidal regions is a spawning by forage fish. So forage fish we think about as ones that other fish are going to be feeding on primarily. So in the Puget Sound area, it's surf smelt, herring, and sand lance. And this is a map showing all the suitable habitat. This is not necessarily where spawning has been documented, but it's habitat that WDFW and Washington Department of Natural Resources have identified as suitable habitat for spawning. So the magenta or the cyan color, the bright blue color, is all potentially suitable smelt spawning habitat. That's a lot of habitat around Island County. And that's probably thanks to our feeder bluffs, that we have these really large volumes of sediment that are coming down on the shore and getting transported and sorted out at an appropriate size for them. And then you can see that surf smelt are really spawning the highest in that intertidal zone. Then a little bit lower is sand lance. We don't have nearly as many potential sand lance spots, but there are some, particularly around the southern parts of both of these islands. And then herring, and a lot of that is limited to this area up around the Skagit. These big purple areas are just where herring kind of stage themselves before they get into spawning. So we have a lot of potential support for forage fish here in Island County. And did I want to say, I'm going to just, I guess I thought I had another slide on this, but I think it might come later on. But why are forage fish important? Well, they provide a lot of the food for salmon. They're a crucial, when salmon are switching over from eating little things like insects or amphipods or small gobies, these forage fish provide a high caloric content and really provide the fish the opportunity to grow enough so that they can migrate out to the Pacific Ocean, because they need to get away from Puget Sound at some point. They need to go out into the open ocean. And because of the lipid content and the fatty acids that are present in those forage fish, they need to have a lot of that to grow fast enough to get out there at the right time, get out to the Pacific Ocean at the right time.
So hard armoring is not going to be good for this process.
We'll talk about that. We'll get to that. This is all the fun stuff, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. But you're right. So moving from that intertidal zone out into the subtidal area, a lot of that is mud and sand, and there have been over 1,800 benthic invertebrates in Puget Sound identified, and they are estimated to represent more than 50% of the biomass in Puget Sound. Now I'm going to dispute that because I really think that bacteria are your largest biomass, but this is the stuff you can count that you can actually see or manipulate with a pair of forceps. And here are just some representative crustaceans, some mollusks, polychaetes, and echinoderms. These are typical benthic invertebrates. So they're doing a lot of the similar kind of thing that's going on here in this intertidal zone with the mud and sandy area. They're doing a lot of filtering, a little bit of predation, but they're really relying on phytoplankton that have died and fallen to the bottom, or processing water that has suspended material in it, organic material in it. There are also 4 commercially important finfish out there in Puget Sound. Over the years, these have been on the decline, and whether or not that's, except for maybe the dogfish, and part of that had to do with fisheries. There was a strong commercial fisheries in Puget Sound up until the mid-70s, and then much of that has gone away. But Pacific hake is now a pretty important fisheries in its own right, particularly for the West Coast. Pacific cod have really diminished away, and walleye pollock as well. And then there are all these fish that live out here, demersal finfish. There's the soles, the flatfish, and in fact the English sole has been kind of the not poster child, but English sole really made us aware of contaminants that we were putting into the environment, because it was found that English sole that were in urban areas like the Duwamish River or Commencement Bay, those fish had liver tumors at a very high rate and a very high prevalence. And years of study revealed that it was PAHs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that were responsible for this. And that was really a big discovery back in the 70s, because here you had wild animal exposed to environmental levels of contaminants developing liver cancer. And that was a real wake-up call for the Puget Sound area, and really galvanized the people in this area to say, maybe this is something we need to be addressing. And at that time, point source pollution was a big issue. But the star of the show, so to speak, has been the English sole, because it was the one who was really the beacon that woke us up to that. Other fish include the cartilaginous fish, ratfish, which people think are kind of ugly, but they have beautiful eyes, and they serve a role as a scavenger out in the demersal area. Sculpin, again, another scavenger, so here's a great sculpin. But remember that Pigeon Guillemette, they use sculpin to feed their young. So the 2 fish that they use primarily to feed their young are gunnel and sculpin, and this is known from the observations made by the Pigeon Guillemette group. So even though you might think of sculpin as being kind of a trash fish or a vacuum cleaner, it has an important ecological role in feeding these seabirds. And then there are the rockfish, and we have 3 species that are very common here, but we also have a couple of species that are listed species there on the endangered species list. The yellow eye and boccaccio, and they don't occur very frequently in Puget Sound, but recently critical habitat was declared for them, and it covers a lot of area, including most of Island County's waters. So rockfish, as you may know, are long-lived fish. They can go up to 50 years. I think the longest lived one off the coast has been 90 years old. Takes them a long time to reproduce. So when you think about eating rockfish, you might want to check on which species. There are a few species that are shorter lived, but boy, that animal sometimes maybe was around longer than you have been. And then we have poachers, the sturgeon poacher and blue spotted poacher, and again, they're again on the bottom, feeding off the bottom. So I want to talk about a special area, subtidal zone, that is really related to the Marine Resources Committee, and that is bull kelp. Right now, there's a lot of interest in restoring bull kelp, and again, that's connected to the rockfish declaration, because it turns out both juvenile and adult rockfish use bull kelp beds in part of their life history. So bull kelp, it's not a plant, it's an alga. This is not a root, it's a holdfast. These algae can absorb nutrients across their entire length, and this is just a mechanism for holding it to the bottom. Here's one underwater. There's the bulb, which has carbon monoxide in it, which keeps it floating upward, and then the blades extend out from that bulb. And then here is Eby's Landing, the bull kelp bed at Eby's Landing, which you can see pretty easily from the shore. The Marine Resources Committee has focused on 3 beds of interest. One is Eby's Landing, and this bed has been documented since 1911. There was a guy who rode around in a rowboat who was doing an assessment for USDA back in 1910, and he documented everywhere he saw bull kelp. And this bed, along with all the ones along the western shore, were present at that time. So we know this bed's been here and persists for a long time. There's a bed near Paulnell Point, which receives a lot of input from the Skagit. So it's getting a lot of fresh water, it's getting a lot of warm water, it's getting a lot of sediment transport. So very different condition from the one out here that's pretty much just getting marine exposure. And then there's Possession Point, many people's favorite fishing ground. And Possession has an interesting, receives both river influence that would come from the Snohomish and these other rivers, as well as stuff that might be coming up from Central Puget Sound. So if there are contaminants, say, coming up, as well as marine influence. And it's a really good fishing area. So we contrast these three beds with each other. And I'll point out that bull kelp is an annual. It's not there all the time. So what you see, these really large organisms, by and large weren't present in February. They started from a very, very tiny plant, not plant, I keep calling it a plant, from a very tiny organism and grow up to be this size within a short amount of time. And then it's persistent, and then it gets torn up by the storms, carried away or chewed up in the storms. So it has to do that every year. So this is almost kind of like a pop-up habitat, so to speak. It's only there for part of the year, and then it goes away. But it has an amazing amount of life in it during the time that it's there. So just to show some bed area information, in 2000, just in this last year, you can see that the Paulnell Point bed started out you can't see it at the surface until later on in the summer, and then all of a sudden it shows up very quickly. In contrast, the Possession Point bed was actually prominent and kind of plateaued off in area later on in the summer. And then temperatures are being taken to monitor the surface temperature. The 17 degrees is considered to be kind of a physiological threshold for kelp, that above that temperature, there are areas, patches on the blades that release zoospores, and the success of the zoospores to go down to the bottom and colonize the bottom starts to decline at 17 degrees, and it drops off precipitously as that temperature gets higher. So surface temperature is an important measurement for the potential success. And these beds rely on last year's organisms to seed them for the next year. So if you don't get an adequate success, you might start seeing a bed decline. And this is the reason why the MRC is actually monitoring these beds to determine whether or not we can see a decline. So clearly, the Eby Landing bed, getting all that cold marine water, that's temperature's not a problem. But it looks like Paulnell Point could potentially have a problem, and that's probably related to some of the river water coming in. And Possession Point, even though it's located in an area with a lot of action, a lot of water movement, even the temperatures there are starting to approach this physiological threshold. In Island County, for 2018, approximately 17.3 miles, about 9% of our shoreline had kelp associated with it. And obviously, a big part of it is here and out with Smith and Minor Island. But there are patches in many places, including down here around Skagit Head and Possession Point. So we have bull kelp associated with shorelines, and it's definitely is worth keeping an eye on that, because there are a lot of cool critters that hang out in bull kelp. So there are rockfish that actually inhabit bull kelp beds, a lot of shiner perch, particularly on the Paulnell bed. And you know, we kind of think about shiner perch as being food for birds, right? Heron or some other fish-eating birds. But it turns out that Chinook salmon also eat shiner perch as well. So they have an important role, especially if they're on that Skagit side of between Whidbey and Camano Island. Tube snouts, which are kind of little pipe fish, they're related to the seahorse. So kelp greenling. Don't know what species of salmon this is, but you know, when you go out to EB in August, there are plenty of guys shore casting near those kelp beds. So there are a lot of, it's probably coho or maybe chum. And then other kinds of crab and invertebrates that actually inhabit this area. So now I'm going to try, if I can remember how to do this, left click. Oops, nope, shoot. I'll have to go back. Oh, no, right. Did I do that? That's it. There we go. There we do that. So this summer last summer, and we don't need the sound, but oh well, we'll get it anyway, was just amazing for herring. So these are herring schools in the kelp bed. And we've been looking at this bed for 5 years in a row. And this is the first time we've seen herring schools at high density in the bed throughout the entire summer. And they are clearly feeding on things. They're nipping at things going by. The water's cloudy because there's always a lot of particulate material in the water. And kelp has kind of mucus on its surface, and so that sloughs off all the time. It's basically mucopolysaccharides, has its own nutritive value. But they are constantly feeding in there, and they were so thick that you just drifted through, and you could see them everywhere. So it was a great opportunity this summer to document these guys in the beds. And that's Evie's Landing, yeah. But they're also present in Possession. The problem with Possession is the water there is actually a lot cloudier, a lot more turbid, so it's a lot harder to get. If you don't have any lights, you're just relying on ambient light, it's hard to get a good image of it. So, you know, but I'm very curious to find out from WDFW, you know, how they estimated spawning success this past year, and whether this is going to turn, you know, I don't even know what stock of herring these are. You know, there are multiple stocks throughout Puget Sound. So anyway, I have spent hours watching these guys, because it's kind of the reason why you want to be looking at these kinds of habitats in the first place. Okay, let's see, I will go left click and back to that and back to that. Okay, so. Okay.
It depends on how you measure it, but roughly how many miles of shoreline have we got?
About 200.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what about our effects on the near shore? Obviously, the near shore is hugely productive, and it was more productive before we showed up. But, you know, we're here, and now we have to figure out what are we doing, if anything, to improve or maintain the value of the ecosystem that's there. So modification of shoreline is the backshore and the supertidal zones. Just removing vegetation can change your insect abundance and density. If you take out vegetation or remove the logs, you could increase your erosion rates. And also you have less energy absorption. Then there's this modification of the supertidal into the intertidal, and there are two kinds of modifications that we do. One is putting in hard armoring that runs along the shoreline. Typically that's to prevent erosion, and here's a really egregious example because here you've got this great feeder bluff that's just being blocked off by this riprap and the concrete bulkhead. And then there are also groins, which now are perpendicular. You're looking down from the above, that are perpendicular, which are often meant to modulate certain kinds of movement of material. So what happens with a groin is you get deposition on one side and erosion on the other side. So right now there's about 29% of the Puget Sound shoreline is modified by these kinds of adjustments. There's a real effort right now to try to take out shoreline armoring or change it into something that's not quite so hard to allow some of these more natural processes to occur. And Catherine Sobozinski had done a study where she had shoreline that had a modification and an adjacent unmodified area, and then she did an assessment of what kind of the organic material that was present and the insects that are present. And so the black columns, or all the black columns, are natural, the natural shoreline, and then the not black columns are the paired altered shoreline. So wrack, that stuff that washes up like seaweed and algae, was lower in the altered area. The woody debris and the leaf material was lower, and that was pretty consistent across the 4 different sites that she looked at. Furthermore, in supertidal insects, there were the mean number of taxa present was higher in the natural compared to the altered. So clearly making those shoreline modifications reduces the amount of organic material, reduces the energy flow that's going through that nearshore area. Megan Dethier, who is faculty with the University of Washington at Friday Harbor Labs, and she's really been a leader in not only understanding what shoreline armoring does to the nearshore, but also making policy recommendations. And one of her recent papers in Conservation Letters, she had this nice table where she talked about the functions, goods, and services. There's a term called ecological services. And you know, the Nature Conservancy thought it was a good idea to put some of the way natural systems operate into a context that would have meaning for human economic systems. Like if you could put it on a ledger sheet, people will care about it. And so it's kind of caught on, this idea of having ecological services. And you know, that can be something as simple as, you know, oxygenating the air or producing clams or oysters that you can harvest, or salmon that you can harvest. So if you look at this table, you'll see that for the recreational and non-consumptive, which would just be going out and enjoying the beach and the sunset, that there is and here's the categories of mechanisms. There's pretty much a negative impact. It's an indirect negative impact. It can have a plus impact, like say you get a parking area because you put in a bulkhead and now more people can come and they can park their cars. That could be considered a positive impact on that kind of activity. But then when they hop down on the beach, maybe there's like nothing there but a bunch of boulders and not much fun to walk on or nothing to see. And there are these other impacts that are direct impacts, like on forage fish spawning, on supply of insects and other critters, nutrient cycling, habitat provisioning, and then this is going to be an emerging issue, this resilience to sea level rise, that, you know, the idea that maybe armoring is not going to help you out as sea levels change over time. So So basically the take home with this particular paper was that she had a hard time finding anything positive about armoring. Now somebody who owns property who says, hey, I'm losing a foot a year because the waves are coming in might beg to disagree. But there may be mechanisms to work out how to help that person have a good, healthy, functioning nearshore area and reduce maybe that erosion. Because oftentimes shoreline armoring creates a problem that maybe it's not a problem for you, but your next door neighbor is losing. If their property is not armored, the erosion is happening much more quickly over there. So, you know, it's like, how big is your universe, I guess, when you're working up a ledger sheet. The other thing about nearshore habitat, things that we have changed is, you probably know that we've lost like 90% of a lot of the estuarine areas in Puget Sound since 1850s. And for salmon, when they are coming out of that estuary and they're transitioning into the marine system, that's where Island County really comes into play, because we provide them with nearshore habitat to feed, to hang out, and to grow. And here the Skagit River Cooperative System mapped out all the potential places that could be like pocket estuaries or places that salmon could spend time as they move into the marine system. This is just an example of a restoration in Livingston Bay where there had been a diking system, an impoundment, and that got removed. And progressively you can see that this area is becoming more and more like a pocket estuary kind of setting. So they need those areas for rapid growth. It's when they have the highest mortality. So the faster they can grow, the better their survival. And coming back to, this is the one I was thinking about, coming back to the forage fish question. So this is why people care about forage fish, because they really do represent a little bit of a bottleneck for food as it's moving through a food web. And for salmon, Pacific salmon again, we have crab zoea and sand lance and surf smelt and herring are part of this forage fish component, even though people might say crab isn't, but they're still important in this part of the food web. So again, providing habitat for these animals to spawn and to exist, that's important for salmon. And obviously, if you care about killer whales, then, let's go. Then these higher level, the marine mammals are, and we should also mention things like sharks, like six-gill sharks. They're high-level predators and they serve an important role in the ecosystem. So forage fish are important to everything above it and also to stuff below it, because they do provide controls on certain kinds of organisms that they feed on too. So it's both an upward and a downward kind of effect that forage fish can have. We're very fortunate here in Island County. The Planning Department and the Department of Natural Resources take shoreline armoring seriously in the sense that they really are interested in trying to preserve habitat. So there's been a program called Shore Friendly. And if you have neighbors or anyone who wants to know more about this program, it's in active use. Actually, Anna Toledo, who Lauren mentioned earlier, is the coordinator for that. They go out, will do assessments on your property. If you have an issue with armoring that you'd like to take out, they can offer alternatives. It's just so that you don't feel like you have to do all this homework by yourself to figure out what's needed. And the other thing is the Planning Department is trying to formulate zoning regulations that would encourage people to do this, that it is easier to take out the armoring now than it used to be in the past by changing some of those regulations. So there is encouragement from the Island County government to do that. If you've had a chance to go up to Coronet Bay, there was a restoration that was done over an 8-year period, had creosoted bulkhead that was in place, and that got removed, and the natural shoreline was actually restored. It got done in 2012, completed in 2012, and the first surf smelt eggs showed up in 2017. So, yay, that's a win. But it also tells you it takes a while for them to find this spot potentially. People we have sort of, what is it, the goldfish has got the 7-second memory, I think we're worse than that. People want to see a turnaround on a project or a result come back in the next year or two, but systems take a while, but they do come back, but sometimes you're going to have to give it some time to happen. I'll talk briefly about chemicals. I know this is like an alphabet soup of things, but these are the chemicals that we are really concerned about in Puget Sound, the persistent organic pollutants, especially the PCBs, because they've been banned now for, 5 years at least? No, longer than that. But they keep turning up. They keep going through the food web. They keep getting recycled through the food web. And what's really bizarre is that when you look for PCBs in sediments, and that is where they tend to localize in the physical environment or in sediments, there are hot spots for PCBs, usually with urban areas. So why do they keep turning up in herring eggs? And that's a little bit of a mystery. I think microbes might have something to do with recycling that. But those are lipophilic compounds, and they haven't gone away yet. So we worry about those kinds of things because, like I said, they accumulate in lipids, so they get transferred up into, and now we've got killer whales, and as we all know, our southern resident killer whale population have really high levels of PCBs in them, in their blubber. And that's a problem if they start starving because now they're mobilizing those lipids, and now parts of their body, the organs are being exposed to those PCBs, where as long as it was sequestered in the blubber, that was okay. It is a problem also for mothers who nurse because they are accumulating all those lipids, but then that gets mobilized into the milk. So usually the first calf from a southern resident killer whale mom will get a huge dose of these contaminants. So there's a lot of issues around these chemicals. PBDEs have been banned in Washington State. DDTs, we don't have an issue here in Puget Sound, but certainly California. That's a signature of southern residents feeding off the coast of California is DDTs that are present. So again, they're still around. We don't know what to do in terms of it just turning off the spigot, but like I said, they keep cycling because they are persistent. Organophosphates, that can be a problem. At one time, chlorpyrifos was being used out in Grays Harbor to try to kill off the burrowing shrimp, which was creating problems for the oyster farmers out there because it turns over the sediment and basically smothers the oysters. But then they couldn't use that. They went to imidacloprid, I think, and I think Department of Ecology is telling them they can't use that. I think that just came out in the last few weeks. But these are all things that, people kind of expect. You want to do agriculture or you want to do aquaculture, and that includes shellfish. And if you feel like there's something competing with you for your harvest, there's going to be tools that people will use if they're allowed to use them. And then, there's these nerve agents that I won't talk about at this point. Then the other biggie is PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, comes from wood smoke, combustion. Our cars are probably the worst tool that we can use on the environment because they not only put stuff out the tailpipe, but there's all kinds of stuff that comes off the tires and stuff that comes off the engine. And you've probably heard Nat Schultz is an aquatic toxicologist. He lives on the island too, and a colleague of mine. And he's done a lot of work on coho pre-spawn mortality. These are coho adults that move upstream and then die before spawning. And it turns out you can take the runoff from 520 and put juvenile coho into it. You can kill them just like that. Exactly what it is that's in there is not terribly clear, and Nat's group has been working on that. But when you look at Blake Feist did a paper where he mapped out where pre-spawn mortality would occur, and what he found was there was a very strong correlation between main arterials and the probability of pre-spawn mortality occurring. It really implicates Rhodes as being involved in that event. And then here we go. There's something from the Puget Sound Regional Council. It's like, that's an astounding number of miles per day. I mean, that's everybody. And that's just in King, Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap counties. But those are the heavyweights. So a lot of driving going on. And in fact, just recently, there's emerging issues that we're concerned about. Pharmaceuticals, we all take a bath and we all use products that we don't really know what's in it. We figure FDA approved them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's something that's good for the environment. And then plastics is becoming the big hot topic now, or synthetic polymers. And this is a great microplastic study. So microplastics, I think, are less than 5 millimeter in diameter. Really extensive study where they looked at stormwater, wastewater, atmospheric deposition, sources in rivers, and then just aquatic and nearshore activities. And they found that, you know, the stormwater was just an astounding amount of material that was coming in for microplastics. It included probably some other kinds of material, maybe some rubberized products. But you think about microplastics. For us, you think, well, you eat it, goes through you. You don't, you know, so what? You're not really absorbing it. That may not be true, because it may turn out that they are a conveyance for other kinds of chemicals that are a part of them. And so the whole area of understanding the toxics that microplastics may be as a source of exposure to chemicals is a completely unknown area. What we do know is it is bad news for anybody that's a filter feeder, because they can't differentiate between a particle that's made out of plastic and a particle that's organic material. And so there's a real concern about filter feeders and some of the detritus feeders thinking that they're feeding, but they're not getting nutritive value from it. And so again, that's a new area of research. But we've been dumping plastics since they were first being synthesized. And so that's going to be, and I will also say that it's not just the rubble from your water bottle, it's your, you know, clothing and your Patagonia pile outfit that you have. Those microfibers are included in that whole plastic lineup. So, you know, then when you start thinking about your lifestyle, you go, wow, how did I get here? But, you know, it's how our civilization has developed and our society has developed. So if you know something that you can change in